do some framing.
Thanks, Lisa. So our agenda in this paper is connected to but discrete from the paper that Mike gave in the previous session. I think what follows from, and it's a connection that applies to perhaps all three papers, but certainly to what Mike said and what Lisa said, that if we're going to start from the premise that we can't presume, sorry, I'm posing this negatively, but it'll have to do, we can't presume that the principal manifestation of the relation between labour and capital is located in the workplace. Traditionally, we've always thought it's a workplace relation, and labour confronts capital in the workplace, and trade unions defend labour, etc. And we're now saying, hey, it extends beyond the workplace, it extends into the household as well. It's a great insight, but the challenge we then face is to say, how can we put these relations with capital on the same footing? I mean, it's okay to say, oh, I've got an analysis of the workplace over here, and an analysis of the home and domestic labour over here, but how do we get them talking to each other? And really, this paper is not, it is primarily a linguistic exercise, but it's got an analytical agenda. And I guess what I wanted to say is the deep insight you'll see in this paper, that I hope if you see a deep insight, it's not that we understand labour markets differently or better than anyone else, but that we're wanting to say, how can we put labour markets into the language of finance so that what we're talking about in labour's, in households' relations with capital can be seen as part of the same way. I've lost that sentence. That what goes on in the workplace, what goes on in the household can be put in the same language. And of course, we would say there's a politics that underlies that. And that politics is, if we believe that there is a necessity or a desire to resist the power of capital, that this resistance is not just on the one hand in the workplace, on the other hand in the household, but it is a singular point of resistance to a singular capital. So to make that analytically possible, you need to get what goes on in the household with financialisation, what goes on in the workplace, onto the same discourse, same analytical grid. So for us that means we've got to put the issue of risk and the pricing of trading and the pricing and trading of risk front and centre in the way we think about the employment contract. So that's really our analytical agenda. How do we put risk and pricing and trading of risk into employment? But I want to start with several propositions as preliminary before I get to our great insight. First of all, we're not the only people who talk about transferring risk in the employment contract. There is, in the industrial relations literature, an analysis on risk transfer in employment. It's in a literature that goes under this general name of implicit contracts. Its origins are attributed to Frank Knight, although I haven't yet taken the effort to actually source it to Frank Knight. But the proposition that workers are risk averse and entrepreneurs are either risk neutral or risk takers. And the premise of this analysis is then that there can be a synergy between entrepreneurs and workers, because if entrepreneurs take on some worker risks by giving them secure jobs, then we've shared the risk, there's balance. So in that industrial relations literature, as industrial relations is so cursed by this notion of how do we get harmony in the workplace, it's a harmony notion of risk sharing in the workplace. Our concern is with systematic transfers of risk from capital to labour. Second preliminary comment. When capital looks at the value of an asset, it seeks to estimate rate of return relative to risk. The central proposition of modern portfolio theory, starting in the 1950s but still carrying the name modern, the central proposition of modern portfolio theory is that a given return with a high risk, the asset that has a given return at a high risk is valued less than the asset with a given return for a low risk. Risk is priced in that sense as a negative when we're looking at asset values. It's a reasonable proposition, yeah? Something that's more risky, more volatile in its value is valued less, even though its average value might be the same. It's valued less than something that is a stable asset. When we think of employment, though, we don't frame this notion of risk calculation. We have in economics, on the one hand, we have data on a person's income, and we say, or aggregate levels of income. Oh, incomes have been stagnating or declining. We have data on income share, and we can say, oh, the income share of national income has been going down, etc. And on the other hand, we have a literature about precarious employment and casual employment, but the two never talk to each other. We have this literature over here on what's happening to wages and that they're trending down. On the other hand, risk, and the precarious casual employment literature is about a risk literature. Why don't we ever get the two talking together? Why aren't we on the left saying a wage that is earned precariously is worth less than the same wage that is earned by a stable income? Capital does it for its assets. Why don't we do it about employment? And I think the answer is because we never think of employment in terms of risk. I mean, except in a sociological sense of risk of precarious employment. But we don't use that financial notion of risk to say, hey, we should be taking a stand here and say, if employment is going to become more risky, it should have a compensating wage increase to make it worth the same. Third general proposition. I just mentioned, and we all know, employment's becoming more precarious. We find the loss of permanent full-time jobs, the rise of casual, fractional work, 0 hours contracts, etc. What concerns me about this literature is that we're defining employment by what's been lost. There is a loss of permanence. There is a loss of security. And at the moment, because it's a relatively new social phenomenon, we can talk about the end of permanent employment. But we're going to be in analytical trouble if in 20 years' time we're still talking about the end of permanent employment to an audience that never even knew what permanent employment was. So rather than talking about what's being lost in the labour market and always benchmarking to the good old days of the 1950s and 60s and into the early 70s.
When you had tenure.
When you had tenure. Well, we still have tenure. At least you get a payout when you've got permanence. That's what permanence means, yeah. So we need to, or our agenda is to say, what is employment becoming? What is the calculative logic that lies within employment that says we are tracking here a process of change in terms of what labour is emerging towards, not what labour is leaving. It's leaving permanence, it's moving towards, can't we say more than precariousness? Can't we give it a financial logic, an economic logic about what's changing and why? And that's really another little agenda we have here. Fourth and final preliminary point, in the analysis on financialisation, there is, as Mike said, engagement with employment through the literature on shareholder value. That, you all know that literature, that basically financial interests, institutional interests put pressure on corporations to deliver short-term profits, and then corporations go down into the workplace and say work harder and faster and create more surplus because the shareholders want more dividends, etc. So sure, that's true. I mean, no one is arguing other than that's the case, but it's always treating finance as an exogenous force. It's something out there that imposes into the workplace. And we're trying to think in terms of risk shifting about how do we think of financial calculus in the employment contract itself. So, having gone through a few preliminaries, our proposition, not novel in substance, but I said perhaps novel in language and discourse. In substance, our proposition is that employment contracts are becoming more like common law contracts. In itself, that's a fairly standard proposition that you see in the labour law literature. Our emphasis, our edge on it, is that in becoming more like common law contracts, financial contracts are the model for employment contracts because the transfer of risk is the agenda of these changing contracts, and financial strategies, financial calculus, financial modes of thinking are the means by which the trading of risk, the pricing and trading of risk occurs. Now, to shift risk systematically to workers, there are a few well-known contractual things that you all know about, and I'll just tag, but I don't want to spend any time on. One is we know there's a form of risk shifting when contracting relations are transferred from relation of employer and employee to subcontracting, the relations between one capital and an independent contractor. Mike, I know, will talk quite a lot about this in a paper that I'm allegedly an author of, about the construction industry where subcontracting is massively big. So that's one obvious level where risk shifting is located inside the contract because the subcontractor carries all those risks of bad weather and work not happening and etc. I don't want to spend time on that in this paper. Another form of risk shifting is where the contract shifts from the specification of payment for hours worked to payment of work performed, the completion of the job. Again, everyone readily understands that as a notion of shifting the risks for how long the job will take from the employer to the employee. I'm paying you to do the job. If you can do it in 8 hours, that's great. If you can do it in 7 hours, bonus to you. If it takes you 10 hours, that's your problem. But I've covered my risks of the cost of this job as an employer. So we're familiar with these sorts of instances. But what's the underlying financial dimension here? What's the alternative discourse we're seeking to inject? Now we'll get into the story. So the proposition is, employment can be seen as a swaps contract. We normally think of swaps contracts as the dominant version of a swaps contract in world markets is a fixed for floating interest rate swap, where someone holding a fixed interest rate loan takes on the repayment obligations of a variable rate loan, and someone holding a variable rate loan takes over the obligations of paying a fixed rate loan. It's a way of taking a position on the spread between the fixed and the floating rate. And there will be a periodic payment between those two parties according to whether the variable rate has gone up or down relative to the fixed rate. What makes it significant as a contract for our point of view is that as a derivative contract, it involves an exchange of exposures to the performance of an asset, but not exchanging the underlying asset. Yeah? You hold your fixed rate loan, but you take on an exposure to variable rate interests. You hold your fixed rate loan, but you take on, no, I think I just said that, but or the other one. So, again, the point of emphasis, you trade exposures to the performance of the asset, but you don't trade the underlying asset. You retain ownership. How do we think of that as an employment contract? Well, as in any swaps contract, there are two sides to it. There's the worker's side and the employer's side. And I'm going to tell you something that you already know, you just want to frame it in terms of the swap. Workers sell in their employment contract not themselves the underlying asset. They sell exposure to themselves. They sell exposure to their capacity to work. It's exactly what Marx means by the distinction between labour and labour power. People don't sell themselves to the employer, they sell their capacity to work, they sell their exposure to themselves. Labour power, in that sense, is capitalism's first and defining derivative. So that's one side of the swap. The worker sells an exposure to their performance. The capitalist, in return, gives not a share of ownership of the activity that the worker invests their labour in, because the labourer is alienated from the product of their production. The capitalist gives to the worker, in return, an exposure to the performance of ownership. The worker receives a share of the profitability of the corporation. Something akin to marginal productivity theory would do for the broad scope of the proposition we're putting here. So again, it's a swap of an exposure of workers' capacity to work, not the worker themselves, in return for some share of the profitability of a corporation linked to productivity performance, but without giving you any ownership of the product that you've produced. So I'd say this is the straightforward Marxian proposition about the labour market, except that following what Lisa Atkins was saying before, we're talking about the wage being linked to productive performance, and that there is no longer any serious connection between wage and the cost of the reproduction of the worker. But leaving that caveat, that difference aside, it's just a financial reframing of Marx's standard notion of the buying and selling of labour power. In this context, surplus value then is cast simply as the spread on the swap. And we could write a history, we could historicise this swap in terms no different from the way that we conventionally write a history of wages and employment conditions. Yeah? That really it's a linguistic change, but it's a linguistic change of significance in the sense that it puts us into the language of finance and therefore of the possibility of risk transfer. So, I'd say so far in the analysis, no moving parts, just a re-specification. But, and here the moving parts come into play, this swaps contract that is the labour market is not what financial markets would call a plain vanilla swap. There are always embedded options in this swap. That is, there are always, included in the labour contract, rights but not obligations held by the owner of the option. The era that we often now refer to as the era of permanent employment was full of embedded options. And the success of the trade union movement over the first 3/4 of the 20th century was to embed more and more options that were about the worker's private life that didn't particularly relate to the profitability of the employer. That is, rights to holiday leave, sick leave, maternity leave, anti-discrimination, unfair dismissal, OHS, etc. I don't need to give you the full list. So they were things that unions managed to embed in this swap. They were options: the right to sick leave, the right to maternity leave, the right to anti-discrimination. And they're an option because they are contingent contracts. They get triggered when certain circumstances arise, and that's the sense in which they are an option. For the employer, the embedded options were free overtime and a culture of loyalty to the firm. So we would say the objective of labour market reform in the last 30 years is to strip out the options. The options that make employment contracts different from other sorts of commercial contracts. Or more specifically, the objective is to price these options explicitly so that they are extracted from the swap and the employment contract moves closer and closer to that plain vanilla swap. For the employer's option, particularly the option on free overtime, it's removed, but we see the reintroduction of contracts and a culture that sees wages as a payment for doing the job, not for hours worked. So there is inbuilt rights to overtime. For options held by employees, the project of reform is effectively to make workers buy their annual leave entitlements or rights to job security via either a trade-off for lower wages or for external contracts, or by external contracts. So, for example, there's a growing literature that now says firms that hang on to their workers during a downturn are more likely to be the low-paying firms. So if you want job security, the trade-off is you accept lower wages, you'll get more job security. If you want higher wages, you get less job security. Or, the other version is now, if you want job security, you actually can't get job security. You can't get a redundancy like those of us who have permanent employment get. So you can't get a permanent job, but you now buy employment insurance. You now simulate the benefits of permanence through the options market that says, if I get sacked, I have bought income protection. So it's like getting a redundancy, it's like getting a payout, but it's done through the market. So we're observing a growing financial literature framing precisely these sorts of propositions. Moving towards the end of what I want to say, I guess what we can see here is that this is not just a hypothetical argument that Mike mentioned earlier, Sunstein and Thaler, and that Cass Sunstein, who is Obama's advisor administering the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, is on the record as saying that employment contracts should be in the form of opt-in clauses. Not opt-out clauses, but opt-in clauses. So you have, in my language, you have the plain vanilla swap, is the employment contract, and if you want to buy unemployment, protection against being sacked, or occupational health and safety, or anti-discrimination, you opt in and you buy them. Much the same way as when you buy health insurance, there's the basic cover, and then you say, do I want spectacles, do I want physiotherapy, do I want gym membership? You opt into these extra clauses. Sunstein is saying that should be the model for employment, and of course when you put him together with Thaler and their nudge agenda, it is precisely the same sort of thing. How do we put the incentives in place that will encourage people to make rational choices about the little extra options that they would like to embed in their employment contract, but it is going to cost them. And if the state really wants you to do it, maybe the state will subsidise them. It'll nudge you towards making rational decisions. But they are being stripped out as being at the core of a labour market contract. So, just to give a 1-minute conclusion, our analysis, I think, as I've put it so far, leads to no particular conclusions about labour markets per se. I don't think I'm saying anything there about what's going on in labour markets that's new to you. It's just a way of signalling that what goes on in the world of finance is also applying inside the enterprise, inside the corporation, and that the way finance is shaping the world in wider dimensions that we understand is also occurring inside the employment market. Some of you might say, hey, well, I can hear that, but I'm happy to call it neoliberalism or marketisation. I'd say, yeah, it fits under that, but I think those terms are too loose and ideological in their framing. I think what we're trying to do that's beyond just talking about neoliberalism is to say we're trying to track the calculative devices and the calculative momentums that are consciously being brought into play here in the name of marketisation, and that we might call neoliberalism. But what really matters is the calculative momentum, and it affects the politics. I mean, there's one thing to say as opponents of neoliberalism, well, we don't like what's going on and we want to go back to permanent employment. The regulatory reform agenda should be to take us back to something more solid and stable. And I guess I'm saying, hey, if you're tracking the logic, that financial logic that's inside, we know there is no going back here. But maybe there's a different order of politics. Maybe there's a different order of politics that says when you track this logic, this calculative logic, both inside the workplace and inside the home, and see it's the same sort of logic that's applying here. Maybe it causes us to say the way in which we resist the power of capital isn't by saying you want labour market reforms on the one hand and household reforms on the other hand, but there is a singularity of politics that perhaps lies here.